Following the attack, the group were in quite a bad way. The only upside was that Luxembourg's treatment of Erison's infection seemed to have been effective. It was close, but for the time being he was beating the infection. Which was just as well given that it was in his torso. They couldn't exactly remove his torso to excise the infection. Ferry's hunger had driven him out of bed and into the stockroom for a snack, but the pain of his injury soon sent him to the ground once more, awaiting rescue from Trev. With everyone tended and resting, Trev's mind turned to burying Lola. Death of crewmates was nothing new to anyone working on a convict crew, but Trev always liked to make sure that he at least gave them a peaceful resting place, as he hoped that someone would do for him one day too. To this end, he elected to dig a grave for Lola in one of the patches of unpolluted land outside of their worksite. That way it wouldn't be crushed under the mining platform when it arrived, allowing Lola to remain under the stars. As the de facto leader of the crew, Trev buried her himself, and then held a short ceremony for the rest of the crew. With a few quick words uttered to her memory, the crew soon got back to work. With the shacks now cleared of pollution, the group tasked the mechanoids with cleaning out more of the northeast section of the site, joining up their current clear space with one of the naturally unpolluted areas. Although their paralytic Abasia patient, Fur, still couldn't move, Trev liked to visit her when he could, to help keep her company and tell her about what was going on outside her shack. It was an endearing little nightly activity for him. With the tiny northwest shack now empty after they moved Ferry into Lola's old shack, Erison suggested cleaning it out and using it as a small workshop. This would allow them to build an electric smelter in there that they could use to start smelting down all the steel slag chunks strewn across the landscape as a result of all the transport pods that had crashed down from whatever disaster had been happening up in orbit. Giving them an extra source of steel, which was vitally important now that it seemed as though Tim had mined up all he could from the surrounding hills. With Erison finishing up his research into geothermal power, the group decided to utilise the steam vent in the animal pen to build themselves a new generator. It would use up a lot of their precious components, but it should prevent them from experiencing any further power issues. A passing slave ship was looking to trade, and while Trev wasn't overly interested in any slaves, he was happy to sell them a bunch of drugs they'd taken off of fallen attackers, along with some of the chem fuel they had to spare. This allowed him to purchase some more medicine to replenish their stockpiles following the previous attack and the treating of Erison's infection. Whilst heading back to his shack that night, Ferry noticed the presence of a large, rather horrific looking creature lumbering around the settlement. Intrigued, he searched for information about it on the shuttle's computer, and found out that it was a massive version of a tardigrade, which was native to this planet. The computer's files stated that they'd evolved to be able to consume the pollution in the ground for sustenance. Sharing this information with Trev, Ferry suggested that they try and tame one of the beasts, hoping they can feed it the waste packs they're extracting from the ground, and thus get rid of them even faster than the atomizers were currently allowing for. The next morning saw some successes, with Trev finishing up the new geothermal generator. With their food situation now looking very secure, Luxembourg suggested that they minimise the size of their Tox potato farm, saving them some plant work to free them up for other tasks. The mechanoids had also made quick work of connecting the settlement to the unpolluted patch to the northeast. Now that that was done, Trev decided it was time for them to get down to some serious work, and asked Erison to set the bots to clearing out all the way up to the edge of the worksite in the northwest. A bulk goods trader was the next ship to pass in orbit, allowing the crew to sell off a selection of the furs and leathers they'd gathered whilst here, along with their raw, unrefined psychoid leaves. Ideally, they'd refine the psychoid, but they lacked the knowledge and time to do so at the moment, so they'd take what they could get for it now. In exchange, they picked up some more medicine and some plasteel, which they were stockpiling for the time being, purely due to its rarity. The next morning, whilst out at the shooting range, Tim and Trev got in a bit of a tussle. Thankfully things cooled down before either could do any real damage to each other, but given Tim's strength, Trev was likely to feel his bruises for a few days to come. This awkward start to the day was soon overshadowed by Ferry successfully taming one of the tardigrades. He initially led it back to the animal pen, but after popping down a new pen marker in the waste pack storage room, he moved the beast in there, eager to see if it would consume the waste with any real haste. Much to his joy, the beast took well to the dark, cold room and soon began wolfing down the waste packs interred there. This planet seemed to be a magnet for drop pods. Either that or some massive fight was occurring in orbit above them, as yet another pod dropped down, this one containing a Yetikin called Will. Will had quite a selection of skills that would be useful to the crew, so they sent Luxembourg out to capture him, so that they could convince him to join them. With the success of taming the first tardigrade, Ferry had taken to trying to tame others in the area, in an attempt to drastically speed up their waste pack destruction process. One of the local tardigrades didn't take too kindly to his attempts at recruitment, however, and decided to attack the settlement. The turrets did their job, and managed to slow the beast down long enough for beast killer extraordinaire Tim to arrive and blast the creature out of existence. A cold snap had set in across the region, causing the temperatures to plummet. To remedy this, the crew would need to outfit each shack with a heater, but they were already lacking the components for this. The cold weather was clearly impacting the local wildlife too, as it drove a herd of toxalope into a brazen charge towards the settlement. Of course, the crew's guns made short work of the slow-moving beasts, but it put them all a little more on edge for any future attacks. In the early hours of the next day, Fur's paralytic abasia finally wore off, and she was able to get back on her feet again and start helping around the settlement. And, speaking of things to celebrate, Tim and Luxembourg held a small wedding ceremony aboard the shuttle the next day, inviting the whole crew along. The wedding wouldn't be official or recognised anywhere else, but these events were commonplace amongst convict crews, as they helped keep morale up for the duration of the mission. Of course, there was only a small chance that the couple would be assigned to the same job again after this, if they even survived this job, but they both knew that it was likely to be a fleeting affair. In fact, the whole thing gave Trev an idea, and he began flirting with the newly mobile Fur, who was very receptive. Perhaps his little visits to her bedside at night had been less endearing, and more setting the groundwork. Despite the mechanoids being able to work long hours, they weren't making very fast work of the new cleanup area they'd been designated to the northwest. With both components and steel continuing to be a scarcity, Tim suggested some exploratory mining into the hill to the north, just on the off chance that there might be an additional vein hidden in there that they could tap. With the stockpile almost full already, the group decided to use the few remaining bricks they had gained from demolishing the ruins around the area to build an extension to it. That night, their Yetikin prisoner decided to try and escape his prison, tearing down the wooden door with his bare hands. Excited by the prospect of a good brawl, Luxembourg rushed from her shack, ready to beat his ass. Despite Luxembourg having her axe, it was a good fight nonetheless. And she'd even handicapped herself by only using the flat part of the axe, in an effort not to kill the man. She eventually beat him into submission once more, and the group dragged him back to his cell. To everyone's joy, Tim's exploratory mining had been a success, and he had stumbled upon a large deposit of steel that he immediately began working to free from the hill. It wasn't long before Trev proposed to Fur, who happily agreed to marry him. Even by convict crew standards, this had been a whirlwind romance, but if it was what they needed to get themselves through this task, no one was going to stand in the way of that. With a bit more steel in their pockets, Erison began working on gestating another cleaning mechanoid. He could currently connect up to 6 basic mechanoids, and he saw no reason why he shouldn't max that out with cleaning mechanoids as soon as possible. The quicker they increased their cleaning workforce, the quicker they'd get out of here. And, perfectly coinciding with this, Ferry managed to bring a second tardigrade into their stockroom, ensuring that the extra waste generated by the new mechanoids wouldn't pose an issue to them. The very next day, he managed to grab a third, giving them a whole flock of pollution-eating nightmare monsters to keep in the darkness of the stockroom. They'd soon be clearing out the pollution at incredible speeds. The success had clearly made Ferry overconfident, however, as the next tardigrade he attempted to recruit decided to attack him instead. It probably wasn't loving the idea of entering the dark room all its friends had entered and never returned from. Ferry was quite a distance from the settlement, but thankfully the tardigrades don't move incredibly fast. He was able to run back with it snapping at his heels, whilst Fur ventured out to the field to meet them, and helped him to put it down without incident. The next day, whilst Trev was chatting to Will, he went berserk once more. This time Luxembourg was able to get there before he had a chance to tear down the door, and once again, although with greater ease this time, Luxembourg put him back on his ass. The presence of humans operating openly on the surface was bound to draw attention, but the crew hadn't necessarily expected that attention to come from a pack of wargs. Not liking their chances against the incredible tearing power of the wargs' teeth and claws, the group all ran back to the shuttle, allowing the mechanoids and the turrets to serve as a distraction for the creatures in the meantime. The turrets did a wonderful job of pulling the pack apart, creating opportunities for the crew to jump out of the shuttle and take down an exposed single warg, thinning their numbers. With many of the other wargs already sporting minor injuries as a result of the turrets, the crew gained the confidence to venture out and take them down. It was still a bit close, with one of the wargs getting close enough that Luxembourg had to start swinging her axe. But in the end, they managed to take down the vicious beasties without suffering any real damage. Although the mechanoids might disagree with that assessment, as all of them had taken quite a beating in the process. Erison was going to have his work cut out for him repairing them. As Erison is going about this work, there's an explosion to the south, and the group see what looks like a giant alligator ripping apart the carcass of one of the wild tardigrades. With this beast already showing why the crew should be concerned about it, Very and Fur move into position and take care of it before it becomes a real issue. While the wild tardigrades were facing some dangers, those living in the comfort of the stockroom had actually managed to start consuming the packs faster than the cleaners could extract them from the ground. With the increasing size of the cleaning force, the single mechanoid charger was now struggling to keep up. With the tardigrades proving themselves more than up to the task of disposing of the waste packs, Trev decided they should tear down one of the waste pack atomizers, to add an extra charger to the mech lab. Erison was a little hesitant to destroy one of the extremely valuable atomizers that the corporation had provided to them, but Trev explained that when they leave, they'll load up as much valuable stuff as they can, which the corporation will then sell off to be able to reset the shuttle back to its base state after the mission. Although the crew are still enjoying target practice against the dummies, the planet decides to give them a more tangible target in the form of a swarm of boom rats flooding the settlement. The crew tried to move to the south of the settlement to engage the swarm head on, but after seeing the size of it, they decide to retreat after firing only a handful of shots. The turrets, combined with the boom rats' own tendency to blow up upon death, was making good work of thinning out their numbers. With the numbers thinned a little, the group felt more confident in heading back out to finish the rest of them off, which they managed to do with little damage, aside from a few missing fences in the animal pen and a single turret. With things calming down again, Tim went back to mining, exploring further into the hillside, desperately hoping to find more components to bolster their dwindling supplies. One thing they needed components for was to be able to construct a more high-tech research bench for Erison, so that he could continue his work. With the components not being forthcoming, they set up his old wooden research table once more, with Trev tasking him with figuring out how they can refine their psychoid leaves into something a bit more profitable. With the cleaning robots finally making good progress on the northwest section, the site was beginning to look a lot less brown and a lot more green. Even the wild tardigrades were helping out, rushing over to hoover up the waste packs as soon as the cleaning bots extracted them, before the poor lifter bot could even haul them to the stockroom. Speaking of helping out, Will had finally had enough of the beatings, and decided to actually join the crew in trying to get off this rock. Thankfully, given their proximity to the interplanetary trade route, it wasn't long before another bulk goods trader was passing by. They managed to sell off a bunch of their extra supplies, and bought all 18 components the traders had available, along with securing themselves some additional silver for their coffers. The next morning, whilst the crew were sleeping, the mechanoids were finishing up the cleanup on the last sections of the northwest of the site. With Erison getting close to figuring out psychoid refining, Ferry suggested putting a drugs bench in their workshop, now that they didn't need it as a prison. Finishing up the research project, Erison began using his fancy new high-tech research bench that the crew had built him to figure out deep drills and ground-penetrating scanners, to hopefully allow the crew to replenish their steel and component resources easier. With Erison completing his project to find out how to refine psychoid, the crew wasted no time in beginning to refine the current psychoid supplies into some flake, to give them some real bartering power for the next time a trader came along. Remembering that his primary job here was security, Trev decided it was finally time to improve their defences. The ring of barricades had done the job in the short term, but it was far from perfect. With the mechanoids handling all the other work though, the humans had plenty of time to start cutting bricks to build a bigger defensive structure. First though, they need to expand the workshop to accommodate one more workbench. With the northwest completely cleared, Trev decided that the mechanoids should focus on the northeast of the site next. Once that was done, they could start working their way south. With a combat supplier passing by, the crew soon had a chance to sell off their flake, which felt good since they'd grown it and refined it themselves, but it was also nice not to have a bunch of drugs floating around that someone could binge on if they happened to have a mental breakdown. They only secured a couple of components in return, but they would still help a little. With a brick manufacturing line set up, Trev began working with the rest of the crew to plan out a large marble wall which would encompass the entire site they were clearing. Due to the poor quality of the ground around the site, some of the walls would need to be wooden, and some areas of the wall would deviate slightly from the 130 by 130 grid, but as long as it protected them, then it would be doing its job just fine. Of course, the locals weren't about to wait for the crew to improve their defences, and they launched an attack as the northern section of the wall was still very much under construction. The attackers took a very scattered approach to their attack, allowing the crew to get into position and take out the northern group of attackers one by one. In the process, the lifter mechanoid was killed, but Erison would get him back to life as soon as the fighting was done. Moving to engage the other group of attackers, they found them heavily distracted by the turrets on the east of the settlement. Adding their gunfire to that of the turrets, they soon managed to rout the second group too, allowing them to come out of the fight having only lost the lifter and a single turret. A pretty great outcome with their new defensive wall barely even being started. There were two stragglers in the centre of the settlement, and the crew, feeling confident from the rest of the fight, charged headfirst into them, blasting all the way. They did manage to take out the attackers, but in their hubris, poor Fur took some pretty nasty shots, and was losing blood fast. Thankfully that was the last of the attackers, and Luxembourg was able to treat Fur's wounds before the situation became too drastic. Although Fur had been tended to, the pain from her injuries really tanked her mood, and the next day she suffered from a mental breakdown, deciding to launch an attack against poor Ferry. Being skilled with his fists, Tim decided that he should step in and try to subdue Fur. To everyone's shock though, one of Tim's blows hit Fur in the neck, where she'd already been severely injured by one of the attacker's gunshots. The existing damage, combined with Tim's massive strength, caused Fur's neck to snap completely, killing her instantly. Everyone was in a state of shock, not least of all Trev, whose partner had just been killed by another member of the crew. Trev said that he was understanding, that he knew Tim had simply been trying to protect Ferry and that it had all been a terrible accident. But Tim felt like he might want to keep his distance from Trev for a while. Trev picked out a nice spot for Fur next to Lola and buried her in the ground. That evening, Trev tried to host a funeral for Fur, but it's possible that doing so in his fragile mental state wasn't the best idea, as the rambling, barely coherent speech left everyone feeling a little concerned. Trev tried to throw himself into his work on the new defensive wall, but his anger at everything overwhelmed him and he went berserk. Unfortunately, Tim also happened to be the closest to him at the time. Terrified of accidentally repeating the same mistake again, Tim fled, trying not to engage with the furious Trev. Unfortunately, Will didn't realise the danger and got close enough to invite Trev's ire. As Will ran, a cloud of ash began to settle across the land, as a nearby volcano's eruption blotted out the sun. The temperatures would soon drop drastically, and planting new crops would become very difficult. Despite taking a few punches along the way, Will was able to eventually outrun Trev, escaping his sight and getting to safety, leaving Trev to simmer in the animal pen, punching any of the boomalopes who got close enough to him. He soon managed to take it too far though, and killed one of the baby boomalopes, setting himself and the animal pen alight in the process. With the fire threatening the whole pen, the group couldn't afford to ignore it any longer, and Tim, ever the hero of the group, approached, resolved to beat Trev into submission if required. In another accident, albeit one with a less dangerous outcome, Tim's shotgun went off before he even got close to Trev, grazing Trev's torso and sending him spinning to the ground, injured but alive. While Tim carried the injured man back to his bed for treatment, Erison rushed in to extinguish the fire. On the upside, prior to losing his damn mind, Trev had essentially finished the northern section of the new wall, giving the crew the chance to start planning out the eastern section of the wall too. There was nothing quite like a shotgun to the chest to bring you crashing back to reality, and the bandaged Trev was soon back working on the wall alongside Luxembourg. Of course, there may be more pain in his future, as another group of attackers drop pod in right on the Tox potato field, and right on top of Trev. In his injured state, he elects to simply run, hoping to make it back to the safety of the shuttle, whilst Tim takes up a position behind cover to watch his back as he runs. Between the turrets, an angry tardigrade, and the attackers scattering in all directions, it's an extremely chaotic fight. Luxembourg rushes to the aid of Will, who has found himself dealing with two attackers alone, whilst Ferry posts up at the barricades alongside Tim. Thankfully, a number of the attackers in the field are distracted shooting at the mechanoids, the turrets, and the tardigrade, allowing Ferry and Tim to focus their fire on the most immediate dangers. With backup from Erison, Trev leaves the shuttle to enter the fray to the south, while Luxembourg beats on the attackers who've managed to take down Will. And in just a moment, it's all over. It seems as though Tim and Ferry had managed to obliterate the main body of the group, causing the others to give up the fight and flee. Or attempt to at least. Luxembourg wasn't interested in letting her quarry leave. There were a few injuries among the crew, but nothing too major, and one of the attackers had even managed to survive, giving them a prime candidate for a new member of the crew. Despite the volcanic winter, the crop fields seemed to still be growing, so in the interest of securing themselves a bit more variety in their food, the group planted a field of onions in the newly unpolluted area to the north. Trev's mental state had never properly recovered, and he soon entered a catatonic breakdown. No one really held it against him though. He'd had a rough few weeks, so they were happy to let him rest and recover. Throughout all of these events, the cleaning crew were still working away diligently to clear the pollution from the site, making slow but very steady progress. Before long, the clouds of ash falling from the sky started to get a distinctly toxic taste to them, making the site even more dangerous and ensuring that their crops would no longer survive. With a shortage of gas masks, Will took one from their prisoner for himself. The prisoner, along with the unmasked Erison, would be restricted to the shuttle until the worst of the fallout had settled. Another drop pod soon crashed to the surface, spitting out Nunez. Not wanting to leave her to simply bleed out in the toxic hellscape, Luxembourg rushed out to rescue her, bringing her back for treatment in a makeshift hospital in the shuttle. Thankful for the rescue, and also probably realising it was her best way off the planet, Nunez thanked the crew by signing up to help them out. As this was the first time in a while that they'd managed to gain a new crewmate without losing someone else, or without one of the others getting into a relationship, they had to build a new shack for Nunez. The toxic fallout was beginning to affect the animals in the pen, so the crew rushed to erect a small canopy in the pen to protect them from the worst of the fallout. A visit from a passing combat goods trader yielded an unexpected win for the crew, as they were able to purchase 2 vac suit helmets. Helmets designed for the vacuum of space, which would be more than suitable to protect the crew from the pollution and the toxic fallout, allowing Erison and Nunez to continue working outside despite the danger. A few days later, Trev was back on his feet, and with his help the crew had finished the eastern section of the new defensive wall too. With the construction going quickly, they began planning the southern and western sections of the wall, which would work to finally actually enclose the site. While a torrential downpour soaked the ground of the planet, their prisoner Woog decided to join the crew, whereupon he was immediately handed a gun, and eventually some clothes, and told that he'd need to use his skills to earn their forgiveness for the attack against them. With the crew finishing up the walls, there was now only one pathway into the site on the western edge. In the interest of increasing security, the crew began to stack a few turrets there. However, given the locals' continued use of drop pods to launch attacks, they kept a few turrets scattered at other sections of the site too, and left the barricades standing, just in case they needed them. Of course, the volcanic winter, the toxic fallout, and the torrential rain weren't cataclysmic enough for the universe, so it decided to also strike down a number of the crew with malaria. Thankfully they still had plenty of medicine stockpiled, as they'd been careful to buy it whenever the opportunity arose, so they should all survive, although they may need a few days in bed to recover. And, as they lay in bed recovering, the toxic fallout and volcanic ash both began to settle in rapid succession, putting the world back to rights once more. The mechanoids were still working away, and were making excellent progress on the northeast side of the site. Thankfully over the coming days, despite the weather continuing to rage against them, the crew all managed to overcome their malaria, showing the universe that it couldn't stand between them and their eventual freedom. They had relegated Woog to a small bed in the mechanoid lab whilst they handled everything else, but now that they had a moment to breathe, they began throwing together yet another shack for him to call home. With the crew now bigger than ever, the defences better than ever, and the work progressing at a great speed, the crew actually started to feel a little hope for the first time in a long time. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever is, wherever you are. Tuna here just to say thank you for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this series so far. Personally, I really am. I think we're getting some really good character stories out of this little batch of convicts we have here, but I may be a little biased. I shall have more out for you soon to continue this tale, but until then, I just wanted to say that I hope life is treating you well, and I hope you're doing your best to look after yourself. Bye bye!